What's up guys? Well, we finally got to see a Williams on track, didn't we, for the first time this week, albeit very late. Lots of people have said to me, how much of an impact is that going to have? Of course it has an impact. You've lost valuable days, and when there aren't very many days at all before we get to Australia, it has to have some impact. But the car has run, and what will happen now is they'll build up, they'll readjust their program and their run plan for the second test to just squeeze everything in. They'll have to achieve a little bit less, but they'll achieve the important things, and hopefully it's reliable, and then hopefully it's quick. I am pleased to say that the real car does look considerably different from the initial renders, or the launch spec car, and the renders that were then released the week before that. And it's still not complete. You know, it's so late that there weren't all of the new components on the car. So for the second test next week, I'm sure we'll see an even more advanced version. But I am pleased to say there's some quite nice and really interesting and innovative details on this Williams FW42. So let's have a little look. Now, the front wing is, I guess, well, what's interesting is the front wing has shifted from the initial concept that the team showed when they were one of the first teams to show their hand, if you like, show their first concepts of a 2019 front wing last year at the Hungarian, post-Hungarian GP test, if you remember. They were one of the teams, along with Force India, who brought along a 2019 wing. And you could see in those incidences that the front wing was looking much higher. They were looking to maximise this entire space with wing elements. Perhaps that's the most natural assumption. And interestingly, that is what Mercedes and Red Bull have still kind of done. The rest of the field have started to move towards this higher inboard edge, then sloping down, tailing off towards the end plate with a lower squashed set of elements towards the outboard edge. And that seems to be the common way of thinking now, having had 6 months, 8 months further development since those initial sightings of what a 2019 front wing might look like. So what is interesting is why Mercedes and Red Bull have stuck with that initial idea, what seems like a pretty basic and I guess relatively obvious idea. And will we see that change over the second test? Will we see the bigger teams who have the resource to react to the other teams very quickly? Will we see them quickly design and manufacture a front wing more towards this, and then even more extreme versions of this that we've seen on other things like the Sauber, for example, and the Renault, dropping right down even lower, halfway down the front wing end plate? We'll see. But Williams moving towards this kind of arrangement, much bigger slot gaps than we've seen in other cars, and what they've chosen to do is open up the slot gaps between the elements here, but even more so towards the inboard edge, so the outboard edge. So whilst on these lower elements, relatively small slot gap along here, opening right up, creating a much bigger channel, again looking for that outwash effect that's been pegged back by the 2019 reg. So their take on that is not to cut the end of the flaps off like Sauber have done, but to open up the slot gaps into big chunky slot gaps between each of these elements to push airflow out through there towards the outboard edge of the tyre. Now they've got some interesting detail around these edges. You can see what I'm talking about with the bigger slot gaps on the outboard edge just here of these upper elements towards the end plate. But they've got a really interesting detail around the front wing flap adjuster here, which, I mean, to me screams illegality. But clearly they must think there's some kind of loophole in terms of calling it a shroud for that wing flap adjuster. But look at this upper flap here, obviously trying to generate much more outwash. And what they've done, because you can see it better on this side, is cut away the edge, the rear trailing upper edge of the end plate to allow a gap for that top fin, I don't know what else to call it, a fin, a scoop, a shroud, to push all that airflow coming off these top two elements and straight out through that cutout on the end of the end plate there. So another take on regaining this outwash effect that we've lost, or lost to a certain extent, with these 2019 rules. Whether that will remain on the car, whether that will continue to be allowed, I don't know, because to me that screams of all the things that we've tried to taken off the car for 2019. Whether they're calling that, as I say, I suspect they're calling that some kind of shroud around the adjuster, but we'll see whether all the other teams would agree with that interpretation or not. But you can see again here, much smaller slot gaps here, much bigger, wider slot gaps towards the outboard edge, slightly upturned as most of them have come on the main plane. But I guess other than that, relatively conventional. But I quite like their take on the fact that they're trying to push the outwash through a little slot or a little cutout here. Just another kind of innovative way of thinking about it. The front suspension is different to things that we've seen on other cars. The idea is similar in that they have gone for this raised front wishbone like we see on the Mercedes, but the way they've gone about it is very different. They've got this enormous bulbous carbon fibre shroud over that bracket that raises the suspension up. To me, it doesn't look as intricate as it could be. It looks bulky. Lots of teams have used this bracket here when they've done it as part of, as an aerodynamic device to push the airflow around the inside of the tyre and down towards the barge boards. That to me doesn't look like it's doing that. It doesn't look like it's having a significant aero effect that some of the others have utilised that area for. So in that sense, I mean, look, I haven't seen the wind tunnel traces, I haven't seen the CFD models, but that's just my opinion on it. Again, it might be something that gets developed as the weeks go on, bearing in mind that this car was very, very late to the party. This is an interesting picture. First thing we can see is the S-duct. You don't often get to see the S-duct from that angle, so you can see here that's where the duct is venting airflow that's been taken from underneath the nose cone or underneath the side of the front nose there, pushed through an S-shaped duct inside around all the components inside, like the steering rack. There's a carbon fibre S-shaped shroud that runs up the front of the chassis and exits that high-speed air along this little channel here through this duct to keep the airflow attached along the top of the chassis here, to stop it detaching. As I've talked about lots of times previously, because of the change in angle of the nose cone and then the chassis, it's very easy for the airflow rushing up the top of the nose to then just want to continue off in the same direction, detaching from the top of the chassis. But by injecting some energized, highly energized airflow coming out along the top of here, it just keeps that energy attached. It's swirling around here, it keeps it attached to the top of the chassis, and therefore the other airflow that's passing over the top wants to follow that energized line and stays attached. All the while that airflow is attached, we have control over it. We can then send it off to the other areas that we need it to work. Suspension, you can see from the top angle, you can see first of all how aerodynamically formed all of these components are. That's not unique to Williams, that's just a common Formula 1 thing these days, but you don't often get to see it very clearly from this angle. So that's quite nice to see. Really, really sharp trailing edges. And very angled in a particular fashion, particularly this year, to direct airflow down towards this now lower barge board section that it can then be worked through, and further back the side pod inlet. But interestingly on this, we've got an extra element on the trailing edge just behind the lower wishbone. Now, you aren't allowed to split the wishbone into multi-element components. So how have Williams managed to get away with this? Well, I think, and I don't know this for sure, but I think what this will be, Williams will claim that that is an independent aerodynamic shroud around something like a brake line or a tether or electrical harness running from the chassis out to the uprights. And I suspect they're just saying, look, we've had to put an extra shroud around these components to keep it aerodynamic. By making it completely independent from the wishbone, I suppose they get away with that. But that's another area. If it's deemed legal, if no one puts in some kind of complaint, and if no one questions that, that's an area that I can see lots of other teams wanting to pick up on and develop themselves. Even more important this year, because of the fact that the barge boards here have even more work to do this year because of the simplicity of the front wings. The tyre wake, the front tyre wake, is being dealt with in a much more aggressive fashion by the barge board. So if we can control and tidy up the airflow towards that by putting extra elements on the back of here, well, absolutely, it could be a valuable way to do it. So keep an eye on that. I suspect that will either get banned or every other team will start to look into that area as a potential advantage. Speaking of those barge boards, you can start to see in this picture some quite nice detailed work around here. I still think this is an area that will get developed more and more, particularly by the big teams with the big resources, because of the work that this has to do. I think Andy Green at Force India said, you know, about a third of the work in terms of aerodynamic work now on a Formula 1 car is now being done by this barge board area, whereas last year maybe that was a quarter, because of the complexity of last year's front wings that were doing perhaps a lot more of the control, flow control work. Well, now this becomes even more important than ever. So as an area of development, I suspect that this will be absolutely rapid in terms of its rate of change and development over the next test and the first few races. That's another quite good picture, just showing the exit of that S-duct coming out here. And this here, you can see the cut lines, the shut lines of a panel on top. If at some point you want to run without an S-duct because you feel it introduces more drag over and above the benefit, that panel will be able to be replaced. That will then seal up that, and we can do away with it if we want. So it doesn't have to be a permanent fixture on the car for the whole year. There's some quite interesting detail around the mirrors, and Williams have gone for a convex mirror. The bent glass here, which will give a very distorted image for the driver, but ultimately no one really gives too much notice to what the driver can see out of these things. It's much more about how we can use it for aerodynamic benefit. What they've been able to do is, by making that glass convex that way, they've been able to shape the back of the mirror very tightly to it. So now we've got a mirror that doesn't have to be deep to accommodate a flat piece of glass. It can now follow the shape and actually be slightly curved to give almost a bit of outwash. I suspect, I can't tell too greatly from that image, but I wonder if that's also angled in a slight downwards fashion just to aid the outwash from the barge boards, taking away that front tyre weight. But actually it's quite a clever way of doing it, and as long as the driver is able to sort of see something, which he will be able to, because you have to pass a test as a driver. You have to sit in the car with someone behind it pointing out, a little bit like you do on your road car driving test. You don't have to read a number plate, but you do have to be able to see certain things whilst you're sat in the car using your mirrors. And he will be able to do that. Whether he'll be able to pick out too much detail, maybe not, but maybe that doesn't matter so much. But in terms of aerodynamics, quite a nice detail. An extended aerodynamic arm like most of the others have used as well. So this area now being very much used to help control airflow towards the rear of the car. Okay, some nice work around the side pods, much smaller, much higher, a little bit in line with what some of the other teams have done, raising that opening up high, using the crash structure as a very much an aerodynamic aid, and continuing that all the way out, using this extended winglet and then upright piece connected to that crash structure to create channels that will accelerate airflow down over and along the side pod. We've got a very big undercut at the front of the side pod. Now that kind of goes away from some of the current thinking. If you think about the Red Bull, actually they don't have much of an undercut at all at the front edge, moving lots of the components and the installation of the power unit much further forward, which of course helps with centre of balance as well, and then having the huge undercut towards the rear. Well, Williams haven't really gone down that route. They've gone almost the opposite. This is the kind of thinking of a few years ago that some teams still employ, but actually the fashion tends to be moving the other way, with a big undercut at the front, and these barge boards and these winglet areas here helping to shovel airflow fast as they can through that section, upturned piece of the floor to help guide some of that rearwards through this, creating a sort of aerodynamic channel around here. It'll follow the contour, of course, of that bodywork and then send off through this area, through here, this big area towards the rear of the floor where it gets worked incredibly hard above the diffuser. But just interestingly, a different take on some of the others around that area. Very Mercedes-like up here. Perhaps not too much of a surprise given they've got the Mercedes power unit in the back of this thing. Very, very, I guess what we'd say is conventional now in terms of the floor. Angled slot gaps towards the rear, longitudinal slots along here, and then an upturned lip at this part of the floor. Nice work around here. These uprights, much bigger than some other teams have used, but again, all aggressively trying to push away the messy turbulent tyre weight from the front tyre and stop it from getting in underneath this floor, from sealing, trying to seal, along with these slots along the edge of the floor, trying to seal this gap here. It's quite a high rake car, so even more important to seal this gap and to prevent any of this messy turbulent tyre weight slipping and finding its way underneath the floor, which will then massively hinder the efficiency of the diffuser itself. So this is quite nice, but again I think it's going to develop and change as we move forward. Nothing groundbreaking towards the rear that we can see at this stage. The diffuser I did see on a very low res picture, which wouldn't really work on here, but didn't seem to have too much work going on, and it may well be that's not the finished diffuser, the finished floor section yet. So that, again, we've got to kind of put that caveat out there that this may well not be a complete car, and next week in Barcelona will be a much better test of what this thing will look like. But some nice details. Doesn't look like it's going to be revolutionary in that sense, and from what we've seen on track, although it's very, very early days, it certainly doesn't look to be setting the world alight just yet. But let's not forget, they are at least 3 days behind, if not more than that, behind everybody else in the field. The worrying thing might be that for most other people, even on day one of that first Barcelona test, they were running around at reasonable pace and for hundreds of laps. Williams haven't been able to do that yet. Let's hope they can recover it. I think we all want to see Williams back up there. So fingers crossed that the parts they bring next week and the development time they will have over the course of the next test and between then and Melbourne will get them somewhere further towards the bulk of the pack.